The cruelest exile is the one carried out by your own family. The sentence drifted across the stone courtyard long before anyone dared to breathe again. Under the pale glow of the full moon, Claire Ashford stood alone at the center of Ash Hollow Pack, surrounded by nearly 200 silent wolves whose familiar faces now felt more distant than strangers. The cool autumn wind tugged gently at the hem of her simple gray wool dress while loose strands of chestnut-brown hair brushed against her pale face. She had walked across this same courtyard every day since childhood, laughing beside friends, helping elderly neighbors carry baskets home, believing the ancient oak overlooking the village would always watch over her. Tonight, the towering tree witnessed something entirely different. Richard Ashford stood before the council stone wearing the ceremonial black cloak reserved for pack elders, its silver clasp reflecting the moonlight like frozen ice. His broad shoulders remained perfectly straight, but his eyes refused to meet his daughter's. Beside him stood Lydia Ashford with folded hands and carefully composed elegance, while Damien Holt waited several feet away among the young alphas, his expression trapped somewhere between discomfort and silence. Around them, the villagers formed an unbroken circle. Mothers held frightened children close. Elderly wolves lowered their heads. Young warriors crossed their arms without speaking. No one stepped forward. No one questioned why the daughter who had spent years serving everyone else now stood alone before the entire pack. Claire slowly tightened her fingers around the worn leather satchel resting against her side. Everything she still owned fit inside it. 2 changes of clothes carefully folded by her late mother years ago. A small silver comb with delicate engravings worn smooth by time. 1 faded family photograph taken during a harvest festival when laughter had still echoed through the Ashford home. She remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. Richard had lifted her onto his shoulders while proudly introducing her as the brightest future of the family. Somewhere between those memories and this moonlit night, disappointment had quietly replaced love. The council elder cleared his throat before reading the official judgment, his voice steady despite the heaviness hanging over the square. Claire Ashford has failed to awaken the wolf blessed to every child of this pack. She brings uncertainty where strength is required. Elder Richard Ashford has requested that her place within Ash Hollow be permanently withdrawn. The words settled over the gathering like cold rain. Claire closed her eyes for only a moment. She had known this decision was coming long before tonight. Ever since her 18th birthday passed without her wolf answering the sacred moon call, whispers had followed her through every street, every gathering, every celebration. At first people offered encouragement. Then concern. Then pity. Finally came avoidance, as though disappointment itself might somehow spread from one heart to another. Richard slowly stepped forward. His deep voice carried easily through the silent crowd. Claire. She raised her eyes to meet him, searching for even the smallest trace of the father she once knew. She found only duty. From this night forward, you are no longer a member of Ash Hollow Pack. Leave these lands before sunrise and never return. A sharp breath escaped somewhere within the crowd. Several villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but none challenged the order. Claire swallowed the tightness rising in her throat before speaking with remarkable calm. Is this truly your decision? The question floated gently beneath the ancient oak. Richard hesitated for the briefest heartbeat before answering without emotion. It is. Something inside Claire quietly broke, not with anger, but with acceptance. She bowed her head respectfully toward the council, then toward the villagers who had once been her family. Without pleading, without tears, without demanding justice, she turned toward the great wooden gates standing open beneath the moonlight. Every step echoed across the stone path until the sound became the only thing anyone could hear. Behind her, not a single voice called her name. Not one hand reached out to stop her. As Claire crossed the boundary of Ash Hollow carrying nothing but a small satchel and the memory of a home that no longer wanted her, none of those watching realized that the moon had already begun leading her toward a destiny greater than every life they believed they understood. Claire did not look back after the gates disappeared behind the towering pines. She knew exactly what she would see if she turned around. The watchtowers where she had once waved to returning hunters. the smoke rising from the stone chimneys she had helped repair every winter. The old wooden bridge where her mother had taught her to skip smooth stones across the creek. Those memories belonged to another life now, and carrying them any farther would only make each step heavier. The forest welcomed her with a silence unlike anything inside the pack. No whispers followed her through the trees. No judgment lingered behind curious eyes. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of golden leaves drifting across the narrow trail and the distant murmur of water flowing somewhere beneath the thick canopy. Claire tightened her worn cloak around her shoulders as the cool autumn air settled across the wilderness. She guessed she had already walked nearly 3 miles beyond Ash Hollow, farther than she had ever traveled alone. The moon still hung above the treetops, bathing the forest floor in pale silver light that slipped between ancient branches like quiet rivers. Every breath carried the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and moss resting on weathered stones. It should have felt frightening. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, no one expected anything from her. No one measured her worth against a gift she had never received. After nearly another mile, exhaustion finally slowed her steps. She reached a shallow creek winding through the forest and lowered herself onto a fallen oak resting beside the clear water. Her feet ached from walking across rough trails in thin leather boots, yet she welcomed the discomfort. Physical pain felt honest. It asked nothing except patience. She placed the worn satchel beside her and slowly opened it. Inside rested the few belongings that remained from the life she had lost. Her fingers gently traced the edge of the faded family photograph before lifting it into the moonlight. There she was at 12 years old, standing between her parents during the autumn harvest festival. Richard smiled with unmistakable pride while her mother wrapped one gentle arm around Claire's shoulders. Looking at the picture now, Claire found herself searching for the exact moment everything had changed. Had disappointment arrived all at once, or had it quietly settled into their home one small silence at a time? She folded the photograph carefully and returned it to the satchel. Her mother's silver comb remained beneath it, polished smooth from years of careful use. Claire brushed it lightly through her loose hair before closing the bag once more. It was a simple habit her mother had insisted upon every evening. No matter how difficult the day becomes, she used to say, always leave enough kindness for yourself. Claire smiled sadly at the memory. Kneeling beside the creek, she cupped the icy water in both hands and drank slowly. The fresh mountain water cleared the heaviness from her thoughts, if only for a moment. As she looked into the gently moving reflection below, she noticed something unexpected. The young woman staring back no longer looked defeated. She looked tired. She looked uncertain. But beneath those emotions rested a quiet determination she had never recognized before. She no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. A cool breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it an unfamiliar scent unlike anything she had ever known. It reminded her of cedar after rain, fresh mountain air, and the first snowfall of winter. Claire frowned slightly. Wolves relied on scent more than sight, yet she had lived her entire life unable to sense what others described so easily. This fragrance felt different somehow, almost impossible to explain. Before she could gather another breath, the silence of the forest changed. Somewhere beyond the creek came the unmistakable sound of slow, uneven footsteps crossing dry leaves, followed by a quiet breath that carried the unmistakable weight of exhaustion. Claire slowly lifted her head toward the darkness beyond the trees, unaware that the next person she met would forever change the direction of her life. Claire remained perfectly still beside the creek, listening as the slow footsteps drew closer through the darkness beyond the towering pines. Every instinct told her to leave before whoever approached reached the clearing. She was alone, miles from the nearest village, carrying nothing that could protect her except quiet determination. Yet another voice inside her, the same gentle instinct her mother had always encouraged, reminded her that not every stranger arrived carrying danger. The uneven footsteps stopped for several long seconds before continuing again, this time accompanied by the faint sound of someone catching a careful breath. Claire slowly stood, brushing a few fallen leaves from her gray dress before taking one cautious step toward the edge of the clearing. Moonlight slipped through the branches just enough to reveal the outline of a tall man emerging from between the ancient trees. His dark coat was dusty from travel, and loose strands of black hair rested across his forehead. Although his shoulders remained broad and steady, exhaustion showed in the slow rhythm of his movements. He leaned one hand briefly against the rough bark of an old oak before continuing forward. Claire immediately noticed that he carried no raised weapon and made no threatening movement. Instead, he looked like someone who had spent many miles walking without rest. Their eyes met across the quiet clearing. For several heartbeats neither of them spoke. Claire found herself unexpectedly drawn to his unusual eyes. Even beneath the pale moonlight they reflected a remarkable shade of silver unlike anything she had ever seen. There was strength inside them, but also patience, as though he had learned long ago that true confidence rarely needed to announce itself. The stranger studied her with equal curiosity. His gaze lingered briefly on the small leather satchel resting beside the fallen oak, then on the simple clothes she wore, before returning respectfully to her face. Claire slowly raised both empty hands where he could clearly see them. "I do not wish to cause trouble," she said softly. Her voice carried gently across the still forest without disturbing its peaceful silence. The stranger answered with the faintest hint of a tired smile. "Neither do I." His voice was deep, calm, and surprisingly warm despite the weariness beneath it. Claire relaxed only slightly. "You seem far from any road." He glanced toward the dark woods behind him before replying. "Sometimes the safest path is not the easiest one." The answer sounded honest without revealing very much. Claire recognized that feeling. She had given similar answers herself whenever people asked questions she no longer wished to explain. A cool breeze drifted across the creek, carrying the scent she had noticed only moments earlier. Cedar after rain. Fresh mountain air. Winter snow. Somehow it seemed stronger whenever the stranger stood nearby. She frowned slightly, puzzled by the unfamiliar sensation. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked. The man looked toward the moon for a brief moment before answering quietly. "Tonight, yes." Something about those two simple words stirred unexpected sympathy inside Claire. She knew what loneliness looked like because she had only just begun walking beside it herself. Without thinking, she reached into her satchel and removed the last piece of fresh bread she had packed before leaving Ash Hollow. It was not much, but it was all she had. She stepped forward carefully and held it toward him. "You look like you need this more than I do." The stranger stared at the bread for a long second before looking back at her with genuine surprise. "You have almost nothing," he said quietly. Claire offered the smallest smile. "Then sharing half will not make much difference." For the first time since entering the clearing, the stranger's guarded expression softened completely. He accepted the bread with quiet gratitude rather than hesitation. Before either of them could say another word, the peaceful forest suddenly echoed with the distant sound of several horses approaching at remarkable speed, and the stranger's calm silver eyes immediately shifted toward the darkness beyond the trees as though he already knew exactly who was coming. The distant rhythm of galloping horses rolled through the forest like approaching thunder, growing louder with every passing second until even the gentle murmur of the creek seemed to disappear beneath it. Claire instinctively looked toward the narrow trail cutting between the towering pines. Her fingers tightened around the empty cloth that had once wrapped the piece of bread she had just shared. The stranger remained remarkably calm. Instead of searching for a place to hide, he simply straightened his posture and quietly brushed a few fallen leaves from the sleeve of his dark traveling coat. The exhaustion Claire had noticed only moments earlier did not disappear, but something else rose naturally in its place. Quiet authority. It settled around him so effortlessly that the entire clearing suddenly felt different. Within seconds, a dozen powerful horses emerged from the trees. Their polished tack reflected the moonlight while dark-cloaked riders guided them with practiced precision into the clearing. Every rider carried the unmistakable discipline of experienced warriors, scanning the forest before their attention landed on the lone traveler standing beside Claire. The lead rider immediately pulled his horse to a stop. Relief swept across his weathered face so visibly that he climbed down before the animal had fully settled. The remaining riders followed without hesitation. Claire watched in confusion as each of them lowered themselves onto one knee before the stranger. No one spoke at first. The clearing became completely silent except for the quiet breathing of the horses and the rustling branches overhead. Finally, the lead rider lowered his head respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying both relief and apology. "We have searched every trail since sunset." Claire felt the words echo through her thoughts without making sense. "Your Majesty." She slowly turned toward the man standing only a few feet away. The silver eyes. The calm confidence. The effortless dignity. Suddenly every detail she had overlooked seemed impossible to ignore. This was no ordinary traveler wandering through forgotten woods. This was the ruler whose name carried respect across every northern territory. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood. Heat rushed into Claire's face as she lowered her eyes. She replayed every word she had spoken only moments before, remembering how casually she had offered him bread without knowing who he truly was. "I did not realize," she whispered quietly. Ethan looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn from the beginning. There was no pride in his face. No amusement. Only quiet kindness. "That is precisely why your kindness mattered," he answered gently. "You saw a tired traveler before you saw a title." Claire found herself unable to respond. The captain of the royal guard slowly rose from one knee. His sharp eyes briefly studied Claire before returning to Ethan. "Your Majesty, are you unharmed?" Ethan nodded once. "Entirely." The captain followed his gaze toward Claire again. "Was this young woman with you?" Ethan glanced toward the empty cloth still resting in Claire's hands. "She offered me the last of her food before she knew my name." Several guards exchanged brief, surprised glances. One younger soldier looked toward Claire with open admiration, while another quietly smiled to himself. Acts of generosity were not unusual. Giving away the last meal you possessed to a complete stranger certainly was. The captain stepped toward Claire and bowed his head respectfully. "My name is Marcus Hawthorne, captain of the Royal Guard. On behalf of the crown, thank you for your kindness toward our king." Claire immediately shook her head. "I only helped someone who seemed alone." Marcus smiled faintly. That is often how true character reveals itself. A cool breeze drifted through the clearing once again, carrying the scent of cedar and fresh rain across the moonlit forest. Ethan quietly accepted the remaining half of the bread before looking toward Claire with thoughtful silver eyes. "May I ask you one question?" She nodded. "Where are you traveling tonight?" Claire looked toward the endless darkness beyond the creek, then back toward the path she had left behind. After a long moment, she answered with complete honesty. "I no longer have anywhere to call home." The quiet honesty in Claire's answer lingered beneath the moonlit trees long after her voice faded. "I no longer have anywhere to call home." No one in the clearing rushed to fill the silence that followed. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly, while several members of the royal guard exchanged thoughtful glances. They had expected to find their missing king deep within the eastern forest. They had not expected to discover a young woman carrying her entire life inside a single worn satchel. Ethan studied Claire carefully, not with curiosity alone, but with the quiet attention of someone who preferred observing actions before drawing conclusions. "You speak as though your journey began tonight," he said gently. Claire nodded once. "It did." Ethan waited. He did not press her for details, and somehow that patience made the truth easier to share. "My father is an elder of Ash Hollow," she explained softly. "Tonight he decided I no longer belonged there." The breeze stirred the branches overhead, scattering a handful of golden leaves across the surface of the creek. Marcus looked toward Ethan with growing concern, but the king remained silent, allowing Claire to continue only if she wished. After a few moments she offered a faint smile that carried more acceptance than sadness. "There is not much else to tell." Ethan's silver eyes rested on the worn leather satchel beside her feet. "Everything you own is inside that bag?" Claire glanced toward it and nodded. "Everything that mattered enough to carry." The answer settled quietly into Ethan's thoughts. He had spent years hearing nobles measure people by land, titles, and wealth. Standing before him now was a young woman who had lost every one of those things except her dignity. Marcus stepped closer. "Your Majesty, the road to Blackwood Citadel is safe from here. We should depart before dawn." Ethan acknowledged the reminder with a small nod before turning back toward Claire. "Can you ride?" She looked slightly surprised by the question. "Yes. My father taught me when I was a child." For the first time since mentioning Richard, a distant warmth briefly touched her expression before fading again. Ethan noticed it. Even after everything that had happened, she chose to remember one good memory instead of only the painful ones. One of the younger guards quietly led a calm chestnut mare toward Claire. The gentle horse lowered its head almost immediately, brushing its nose against her open palm. Claire smiled naturally as she stroked its neck with quiet affection. "She likes you," the young guard said with obvious surprise. Claire laughed softly, the sound so genuine that several guards found themselves smiling as well. Animals usually decide much faster than people. Ethan heard the remark and allowed himself the smallest smile. It was the first time anyone had seen that expression on his face since entering the forest. Claire carefully climbed into the saddle with practiced ease despite the long walk that had exhausted her only minutes earlier. Marcus mounted his own horse before signaling the escort to prepare for departure. The riders naturally formed a protective circle around the king, leaving one place open beside Ethan. Without ceremony or unnecessary explanation, he guided his black stallion forward until he rode alongside Claire. "The road is long," he said quietly. "You should not have to travel it alone." Claire looked toward him, momentarily unable to answer. Since leaving Ash Hollow, she had expected suspicion, pity, or indifference from every stranger she met. Instead, she had found quiet respect from the one person whose opinion carried more weight than anyone else's. As the horses began moving through the moonlit forest, Claire glanced back only once toward the dark path leading to Ash Hollow. She felt no anger. Only a strange sense that the life she had lost had already begun giving way to one she could not yet imagine. Far behind them, hidden among the endless trees, another rider entered the abandoned clearing carrying the crest of Ash Hollow upon his cloak, searching desperately for the daughter the pack claimed had mysteriously disappeared before sunrise. The horses moved steadily through the sleeping forest, their quiet hoofbeats blending with the gentle whisper of the wind drifting between towering pines. Claire rode beside Ethan in comfortable silence, the chestnut mare carrying her with calm confidence as moonlight spilled across the narrow trail. She had expected the journey to feel awkward after learning the true identity of the stranger she had met beside the creek, yet the Alpha King spoke with the same quiet kindness he had shown before she knew his name. His title had changed nothing about the way he treated her, and somehow that surprised her more than the title itself. Nearly an hour passed before the forest opened into rolling hills where silver light stretched across fields of tall grass. The air grew fresher, carrying the scent of wildflowers mixed with cool mountain breezes. Marcus guided his horse closer to Ethan. "Your Majesty, we should reach the eastern resting grounds before dawn." Ethan nodded. "The horses have traveled far enough tonight." The escort gradually slowed until they reached a peaceful spring surrounded by ancient maples whose golden leaves shimmered beneath the moon. Without needing orders, several guards gathered fresh water for the horses while others quietly prepared a small camp. Claire carefully climbed down from the mare, gently rubbing the horse's neck before leading her toward the clear spring. The mare lowered her head gratefully to drink. Claire noticed another horse standing alone nearby, its reins loosely tied to a weathered branch. The tall gray stallion seemed restless, shifting nervously whenever one of the guards approached. Without thinking, Claire walked toward the animal with slow, patient steps. She spoke softly, allowing the horse to hear her voice before extending an open hand. The stallion hesitated only briefly before relaxing, lowering its head until she gently brushed its neck. One of the guards stopped in surprise. "That horse has trusted almost no one except His Majesty," he admitted quietly. Claire smiled while continuing to comfort the animal. "Sometimes they only need someone who asks instead of demands." Ethan had quietly witnessed the entire moment from several yards away. He said nothing, yet Marcus noticed the thoughtful expression settling across the king's face. A short time later, warm stew and fresh bread were distributed among the travelers. Claire accepted her bowl with gratitude, but before taking a single bite she noticed one of the youngest guards sitting alone near the edge of the camp. He looked exhausted after the long search through the wilderness, and his meal had accidentally spilled while tending to the horses. Without hesitation, Claire carried half of her own meal to him. "You should eat," she said gently. "Tomorrow will be another long ride." The young guard looked at her in disbelief. "This is your dinner." Claire simply smiled. "Now it belongs to both of us." Ethan quietly watched the exchange from across the campfire. Earlier that night she had shared the last piece of bread she owned with a stranger. Now, after receiving her first proper meal since leaving Ash Hollow, she had shared that as well. She never looked around to see whether anyone noticed. She simply acted according to the kindness she carried within her. Marcus settled beside the king, lowering his voice. "She has no idea anyone is watching." Ethan kept his eyes on the small fire where Claire sat speaking kindly with the younger guard and several members of the escort, her quiet laughter blending naturally with theirs despite having met them only hours earlier. "That is exactly why it matters," Ethan answered. Marcus remained silent, understanding the deeper meaning behind those words. Kindness offered for recognition could be performed. Kindness offered when no reward was expected revealed character. As the camp gradually settled into peaceful silence, a royal messenger emerged from the darkness riding a lathered horse. He dismounted quickly, bowed respectfully before Ethan, and presented a sealed parchment bearing the unmistakable crest of Ash Hollow Pack. Ethan accepted the letter without opening it immediately, but the moment Claire noticed her father's seal pressed into the dark wax, she quietly realized that the past she had tried to leave behind had somehow found the road to her once again. The campfire burned low as Ethan turned the sealed parchment over once before carefully breaking the dark wax impressed with the crest of Ash Hollow Pack. Every conversation around the camp faded into silence without anyone asking for it. Marcus remained standing beside the king while the messenger respectfully lowered his head and stepped back. Claire sat quietly near the fire, her hands resting around the empty wooden bowl she had already cleaned. The familiar crest on the letter stirred memories she had hoped would remain behind the village gates. She watched Ethan's expression as his silver eyes moved steadily across the page. He never frowned. He never sighed. He simply read every line with the same calm attention he gave everything else. When he finished, he folded the letter neatly before handing it to Marcus. The captain read it quickly, then looked toward Claire with visible surprise. "Ash Hollow claims their elder's daughter disappeared shortly after leaving the village," Marcus said carefully. "They request the crown's assistance in locating her before unknown enemies can take advantage of the situation." Claire stared into the fire for several long moments. The dancing flames reflected softly in her eyes, but no anger appeared there. Only quiet disbelief. "Disappeared," she repeated almost to herself. "I walked through the front gate while the entire pack watched." Ethan remained silent, allowing her words to settle naturally. She lifted her eyes toward him. "They know exactly where I went." Marcus folded the letter once more. "According to this message, they fear you may have been taken against your will after leaving their territory." Claire gave the smallest shake of her head. "No one tried to stop me while I was leaving." Her voice carried no bitterness. It simply carried truth. The younger guards sitting nearby exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard enough to understand what the letter carefully avoided saying. Ethan slowly stood and walked a few quiet steps away from the fire, looking toward the dark horizon where the first hint of dawn had begun touching the eastern sky. Claire watched him from across the camp. She had expected him to dictate a reply immediately or send the messenger back with formal assurances. Instead, he remained thoughtful, his hands resting calmly behind his back while cool morning air moved gently through the trees. Marcus approached him after several moments. "Your Majesty, shall I prepare a written response?" Ethan looked toward the awakening sky before answering. No. Marcus waited. Then what are your instructions? Ethan turned slowly, his silver eyes settling first on Claire before returning to his captain. We will deliver the answer ourselves. The words surprised everyone in the camp, including Claire. Marcus blinked once. You intend to return to Ash Hollow? Yes. Marcus hesitated respectfully. May I ask why? Ethan's expression remained composed. Because there are moments when a letter is too small to carry the truth. Claire rose quietly from her place beside the fire. You do not owe my pack anything, she said softly. You could simply tell them I am safe. Ethan looked directly at her. This is no longer only about whether you are safe. Claire searched his face, uncertain what he meant. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. Last night I met a young woman who shared her last piece of bread with a stranger. This morning I received a letter that tells an entirely different story about that same person. He paused briefly before adding, I prefer seeing truth where it happened rather than reading versions of it from a distance. Claire lowered her eyes, touched by a kindness she still struggled to understand. Ethan had known her for only a few hours, yet he was willing to return to the very place that had rejected her simply because he believed the truth deserved witnesses. As the first golden rays of sunrise slipped across the quiet camp, the royal guard began preparing their horses once again. The road that had been leading toward Blackwood Citadel slowly turned back toward Ash Hollow, and Claire realized that before she could truly leave her past behind, she would have to face it one final time. The return journey unfolded beneath a bright autumn sky, and every mile toward Ash Hollow felt shorter than the one before. Claire rode beside Ethan without speaking, her hands resting lightly on the reins of the chestnut mare. The same road that had seemed endless while she walked away alone now carried the steady rhythm of the royal guard, yet her heart remained unsettled. She had promised herself she would never cross those gates again. Now fate was leading her back before even a single day had passed. Ethan glanced toward her as they reached the crest of a gentle hill overlooking the valley below. You may still choose to remain behind if this is too difficult, he said quietly. Claire looked toward the distant rooftops of Ash Hollow, where thin trails of smoke rose peacefully from familiar chimneys. She took a slow breath before answering. Running away did not frighten me yesterday. Facing the truth should not frighten me today. Ethan gave the smallest nod, not because he expected courage from her, but because he respected the quiet honesty in her words. The procession continued down the winding road until the wooden watchtower guarding the entrance to Ash Hollow came into view. A young sentry standing atop the platform spotted the royal banner almost immediately. His eyes widened before he hurried out of sight. Moments later the heavy wooden gates slowly swung open, revealing the main road through the village. News spread faster than the approaching horses. By the time the royal guard entered the square, villagers had already stepped outside homes, workshops, and small market stalls. Conversations stopped one by one as every face turned toward the Alpha King. Then their attention shifted to the young woman riding quietly beside him. Surprise moved through the gathering crowd like a ripple across still water. Claire recognized every street, every stone path, every carved wooden porch. Only yesterday she had crossed these same roads carrying a small satchel while everyone silently watched her leave. Today those same eyes followed her again, but something had changed. No one whispered. No one laughed. Confusion had replaced judgment. Mothers gently pulled curious children closer. Elderly neighbors removed their hats respectfully toward Ethan before staring at Claire with expressions they could not quite hide. Some looked relieved that she was alive. Others looked ashamed. A few simply seemed unable to understand how the exiled daughter of Ash Hollow had returned beside the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. Marcus guided the escort toward the center of the village where the ancient council oak spread its massive branches across the square. Richard Ashford already stood waiting with the council elders, his ceremonial cloak resting neatly across his shoulders. Lydia remained beside him with practiced elegance, while Damien Holt stood a few steps behind, unable to hide the uncertainty in his eyes. Richard stepped forward and bowed respectfully toward Ethan. "Your Majesty," he said evenly. "Ash Hollow welcomes the crown." Ethan acknowledged the greeting with a slight inclination of his head before bringing his stallion to a calm stop. Claire slowly dismounted from the chestnut mare, her boots touching the familiar stone pavement where she had once believed her life had ended. The silence surrounding the square deepened as every villager watched her stand once again beneath the ancient oak. Richard finally looked directly at his daughter. His expression remained carefully controlled, revealing neither relief nor regret. "Claire," he said in a measured voice, "we have searched for you since dawn." Claire met his eyes without anger. "You knew exactly where I was going when you told me to leave." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Several villagers lowered their heads. Others exchanged uneasy glances, remembering every word spoken beneath the full moon only hours before. Ethan remained completely silent beside them, allowing the truth to enter the square through Claire's calm voice instead of his authority. Above the village, the autumn wind stirred the leaves of the ancient oak, and for the first time since Claire had been cast out, the silence surrounding Ash Hollow no longer protected the lie everyone had hoped would remain buried. The quiet murmur spreading through the square slowly faded as every eye returned to Richard Ashford. The elder stood beneath the ancient council oak with years of authority resting upon his shoulders, yet for the first time in a long while that authority seemed uncertain. He looked from Claire to Ethan and then toward the gathered villagers, carefully measuring every expression surrounding him. "Your Majesty," Richard began with practiced composure, "last night emotions overcame good judgment. Claire misunderstood my intentions when she left before we had the opportunity to resolve this matter privately." A few members of the council nodded almost automatically, grateful for an explanation that sounded easier to accept than the truth they had all witnessed. Claire remained completely still. She did not interrupt him. She did not argue. She simply listened. Richard continued in the same measured tone. "Ash Hollow has always protected its own. We only wished to locate my daughter before misfortune found her beyond our borders." Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Yesterday those words would have broken her heart. Today they only reminded her how easily memories could be reshaped when pride stood in the way of honesty. Ethan remained silent beside her, offering neither agreement nor disagreement. His calm presence seemed to invite truth rather than force it. Richard turned toward Claire with an expression that attempted warmth. "You may come home now. Whatever misunderstanding occurred yesterday belongs behind us." The invitation drifted across the square, but it felt strangely hollow. Claire slowly lifted her head. She looked at the familiar houses surrounding the village, at the old bakery whose owner had once slipped her fresh bread after long days of work, at the blacksmith who had watched her leave without speaking, and finally at the villagers standing quietly beneath the ancient oak. She recognized kindness in some faces, regret in others, fear in many. She understood all of it. Then she looked back at her father. "May I ask you one question?" Richard nodded cautiously. "Of course." Claire's voice remained soft, yet every word carried effortlessly through the silent square. "When I asked whether sending me away was truly your decision, what was your answer?" Richard hesitated for the briefest moment. "Claire, that was—" She gently interrupted him, not with anger but with calm honesty. "You said it was." The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. Several villagers lowered their heads. An elderly man removed his hat. A young mother quietly held her child's hand a little tighter. No one could claim they had forgotten. They had all heard those words beneath the full moon only hours before. Lydia stepped forward with a graceful smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Surely this family matter does not need to become larger than it already is." Claire looked toward her politely. It became larger the moment it happened in front of the entire pack. Lydia had no answer. Damien shifted uneasily where he stood before finally taking one slow step forward. He looked at Claire with visible regret. "I should have spoken yesterday," he admitted quietly. "I did not." Claire offered him a small, understanding nod. She appreciated the honesty more than any excuse. Ethan noticed the exchange without saying a word. The Alpha King had spent the entire conversation listening rather than leading it, allowing each person the opportunity to reveal themselves through their own choices. Marcus quietly watched the villagers as well. Their expressions had changed. This was no longer a crowd waiting for the king to decide what was true. They already knew. Richard drew a slow breath before speaking once more. Whatever mistakes were made, Claire is still my daughter. Her place has always been here. Claire felt the familiar ache inside her heart, but it no longer controlled her. Before she could answer, Ethan finally stepped away from his stallion. His measured footsteps echoed softly across the stone square as he walked forward with calm certainty. The villagers instinctively fell silent once again. Without raising his voice or quickening his pace, the Alpha King stopped between Richard and Claire, and in that quiet moment everyone present understood that the conversation had reached the point where truth could no longer be hidden behind carefully chosen words. The square remained completely still as Ethan Blackwood stepped forward, his polished boots making only the faintest sound against the weathered stone. He did not position himself above anyone, nor did he stand behind Claire. Instead, he stopped beside her, leaving enough space for her to stand on her own while making it unmistakably clear that she would not stand alone. The autumn breeze stirred the royal banner behind him as sunlight filtered through the branches of the ancient council oak. Every villager watched in silence, waiting for the Alpha King's judgment. Ethan slowly looked around the square before speaking. His silver eyes rested briefly on the council elders, the villagers, and finally Richard Ashford. "Yesterday," he said calmly, "I met a young woman walking through the eastern forest with everything she owned carried inside one small satchel." His voice remained steady, requiring no effort to command attention. She did not introduce herself as the daughter of an elder. She did not ask for protection. She did not complain about those who had sent her away. Richard remained silent, his hands folded tightly behind his back. Ethan continued, "She offered the last piece of bread she possessed to someone she believed was a stranger. Later, she shared her first proper meal with a young guard who had accidentally gone without dinner. She comforted a frightened horse that trusted almost no one. None of these acts were performed because anyone was watching." Several members of the royal guard lowered their heads slightly, remembering each quiet moment from the journey. Marcus glanced toward Claire with quiet respect. Ethan turned his attention toward the gathered villagers once more. "This morning I received a letter describing that same young woman as someone who had mysteriously disappeared." He paused, allowing the words to settle naturally. "The woman I met did not disappear. She walked through your gates in full view of everyone standing here." No one answered. An elderly council member slowly removed his spectacles, staring at the ground. The village baker quietly folded his hands together. Even Lydia's carefully composed expression began to falter beneath the growing weight of silence. Ethan never raised his voice. "Leadership is not measured by how we speak when circumstances favor us. It is measured by the choices we make when another person's future depends upon our courage." Richard finally lifted his eyes. "Your Majesty, I have already admitted that mistakes were made." Ethan acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. "You admitted a mistake." His expression remained composed. Claire described a decision. The difference between those two words settled heavily across the square. Claire stood quietly beside him, saying nothing. She realized this was no longer about defending herself. The truth no longer required her to carry it alone. Ethan slowly looked toward the villagers. Every person standing here witnessed what happened beneath this tree last night. His gaze moved gently across the crowd, never accusing, never condemning. "I have not returned to determine what is true. I have returned because each of you already knows." A long silence followed. One by one, villagers lowered their eyes, not because the Alpha King demanded it, but because their own memories answered before their voices could. Damien stepped forward first, placing one hand over his heart. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "Claire spoke the truth." The elderly widow whom Claire had helped through many winters slowly nodded. "She walked away alone." Another villager added softly, "No one stopped her." Then another voice followed. "We all saw it." Soon the square was filled not with loud arguments, but with quiet acknowledgments carried by ordinary people choosing honesty over comfort. Ethan listened without interruption. When the voices finally faded, he turned toward Claire. She met his eyes, uncertain what would happen next. For the first time since she had crossed the gates of Ash Hollow carrying only a worn satchel and fading memories, she realized the silence surrounding her no longer belonged to shame. It belonged to truth, and truth had quietly begun changing every heart that was willing to face it. The final echoes of the villagers' voices slowly disappeared, leaving Ash Hollow wrapped in a silence unlike any it had known before. It was no longer the silence of fear or obedience. It was the quiet stillness that followed when truth had finally been spoken aloud. Claire stood beneath the ancient council oak with the autumn breeze gently moving through her loose brown hair. She looked across the familiar faces surrounding the square and realized something extraordinary. For the first time in years, no one was looking at her with pity. They were looking at her with respect. Richard Ashford remained motionless, the weight of every honest voice settling heavily upon his shoulders. He had spent a lifetime believing leadership meant protecting the reputation of his pack above everything else. Now he understood that reputation built without truth could never remain standing forever. He slowly turned toward Claire. "If returning home is what you want," he said quietly, "Ash Hollow will welcome you back." Several council elders immediately nodded in agreement. Lydia forced a gracious smile that looked more fragile than confident. Damien lowered his head, silently hoping Claire might choose forgiveness. Claire listened carefully without interrupting. There had been a time when those words would have healed every wound she carried. She would have accepted them with tears of gratitude, believing she had finally become worthy enough to stay. But standing beneath the same ancient tree where she had been cast aside only one day earlier, she realized something had changed inside her. Home was no longer a place she needed to earn. Ethan remained beside her without speaking. He never answered for her. He never stepped in front of her voice. He simply trusted her to choose her own future. Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward her father. "I appreciate your words," she said gently. "But I did not leave because I wanted another home. I left because I no longer had one." Richard closed his eyes briefly. There was no argument he could offer against that truth. Ethan finally stepped forward. His calm silver eyes rested on Richard before moving toward the gathered villagers. "Yesterday," he said quietly, "Claire was told she no longer belonged here. No one denied it. Last night she shared her final meal with a stranger. This morning she showed kindness to people who could offer her nothing in return. Not once did she speak with bitterness about those who had rejected her." He turned toward Claire, his expression carrying quiet admiration rather than sympathy. "Character is not revealed when life is easy. Character is revealed when kindness survives disappointment." Claire felt her throat tighten as his words settled into the peaceful silence surrounding them. Ethan slowly extended one hand toward her. The gesture was simple. There was no dramatic flourish, no command, no expectation. Only quiet invitation. Claire looked at his hand for a long moment before placing her own into it. His grip remained gentle, steady, and reassuring. He then turned back toward Richard and the entire pack. "Yesterday," Ethan continued, "you declared before every witness that Claire no longer belonged to Ash Hollow." He paused, allowing every face to remember the moonlit gathering beneath this same tree. "I have listened to every voice here today. I have watched every heart choose between comfort and honesty." His silver eyes settled calmly upon the crowd. "Now I will make my own choice." Without releasing Claire's hand, he spoke the words that would be remembered in Ash Hollow for generations. "She is joining mine." The statement carried neither anger nor triumph. It carried certainty. A gentle breeze swept through the square, lifting the royal banner behind the Alpha King while golden leaves drifted quietly across the stone path. One by one, the royal guard lowered their heads in solemn acknowledgement. The villagers remained completely still, not because they feared the king, but because they understood what they had just witnessed. Claire was no longer the daughter who had been turned away beneath the full moon. She stood beside the Alpha King with dignity no one could take from her again, and in that single quiet moment, the place that had once rejected her finally understood the immeasurable value of the woman they had willingly allowed to walk away. The words remained suspended in the autumn air long after no one was speaking. Claire felt Ethan's steady hand gently holding hers, not as someone claiming ownership, but as someone offering certainty. For so many years she had searched for acceptance by trying to become everything others expected her to be. Standing beneath the ancient council oak, she finally understood that genuine belonging could never be earned by abandoning herself. It could only be found where she was accepted without conditions. Richard Ashford slowly lowered his head. The proud elder who had stood so firmly beneath the full moon the night before now seemed years older. His shoulders remained straight, but the confidence that had once surrounded him had quietly faded beneath the weight of his own choices. He looked at Claire for a long moment before speaking. "I believed I was protecting the future of this pack," he said softly. "Instead, I failed to protect my own daughter." No one interrupted him. The villagers listened with quiet respect as the truth finally emerged without excuses. Lydia remained silent beside him, her carefully composed expression giving way to uneasy reflection. Damien stepped back among the council elders, understanding that some mistakes could never be erased, only acknowledged. Claire listened to her father's words with calm eyes. The pain she had carried for so long no longer demanded an apology to heal. It had already begun healing the moment someone chose to stand beside her instead of turning away. She slowly stepped closer to Richard until only a few feet separated them. "I do not hate you," she said gently. "If I carried hatred with me, I would still be letting yesterday decide who I become tomorrow." Tears quietly gathered in Richard's eyes, though he made no effort to hide them. He gave a slow nod, accepting the grace his daughter offered far more generously than he deserved. Claire smiled softly, not because everything had been repaired, but because forgiveness had freed her from carrying the weight of the past any longer. Ethan watched the exchange without speaking. He understood that forgiveness could never be demanded and reconciliation could never be forced. Some journeys required people to find their own path toward peace. Marcus quietly signaled the royal guard, and the escort calmly prepared their horses without disturbing the stillness surrounding the square. The villagers instinctively stepped aside, creating an open path leading toward the village gates. This time Claire did not walk that road alone with only a worn satchel resting against her shoulder. She walked beside people who had already accepted her exactly as she was. Before mounting the chestnut mare, she turned once more toward the familiar village. Mrs. Eleanor lifted one weathered hand in farewell. The village baker smiled warmly. Several children waved with innocent excitement. Even those who had once remained silent now met her eyes with quiet respect. Claire realized that sometimes people learned their greatest lessons not through punishment, but by witnessing kindness they had failed to recognize until it was almost gone. Ethan offered his hand to help her into the saddle. She accepted it with an easy smile before settling comfortably onto the gentle mare. He mounted his own black stallion, and together they turned toward the open gates where golden afternoon light stretched across the winding road ahead. As the royal guard began riding forward, no one spoke. Words were no longer necessary. Claire looked ahead instead of behind, feeling the cool breeze brush gently across her face. Yesterday she had crossed these gates believing she had lost everything that mattered. Today she passed through them carrying something infinitely more valuable than acceptance from a single pack. She carried confidence in her own worth, peace within her own heart, and the quiet certainty that the future waiting beyond the hills had been preparing a place for her long before she ever knew it existed. The journey to Blackwood Citadel unfolded beneath a sky painted with the warm colors of late afternoon, and with every mile the weight Claire had carried for so many years seemed to grow lighter. Rolling hills stretched toward the horizon, covered with golden fields swaying gently beneath the autumn breeze. Birds drifted overhead while sunlight rested softly across winding roads lined with towering oaks. Claire rode quietly beside Ethan, no longer feeling like a stranger traveling through unfamiliar lands. She found herself breathing more easily than she had in years. Behind them, the royal guard maintained their calm formation, speaking only occasionally as laughter quietly returned to the group after the emotional morning. Marcus guided his horse closer with an easy smile. "Your Majesty rarely changes his mind once he has reached a decision," he said. Claire glanced toward Ethan before looking back at Marcus. "I still do not understand why he trusted me." Marcus chuckled softly. "Because he did not trust your words. He trusted your choices." Claire reflected on those words in thoughtful silence. She had never tried to impress anyone. She had simply continued living according to the lessons her mother had given her, even after the world around her stopped believing those lessons mattered. As the sun slowly lowered, the towers of Blackwood Citadel finally appeared above the distant hills. Massive stone walls crowned the mountain ridge, surrounded by flourishing gardens, elegant bridges, and banners dancing proudly in the evening breeze. Warm golden light reflected across tall windows until the entire citadel seemed to shine against the deep blue sky. Claire had imagined royal castles as distant places reserved for extraordinary people. Standing before the great gates now, she realized true greatness did not come from towering walls or royal banners. It came from the people who welcomed others with open hearts. As the gates slowly opened, rows of royal guards respectfully lowered their heads toward Ethan before their eyes turned toward Claire with quiet curiosity rather than judgment. Palace attendants smiled warmly as the procession entered the wide stone courtyard filled with blooming flowers and sparkling fountains. No whispers followed her footsteps. No doubtful glances measured her worth. She was simply welcomed. Waiting near the entrance stood an elderly woman dressed in elegant silver robes embroidered with the royal crest. Her graceful posture reflected years of wisdom rather than authority, and kind gray eyes brightened the moment she saw Ethan approach beside Claire. Ethan dismounted first before offering Claire his hand exactly as he had done throughout their journey. She accepted it naturally, stepping onto the polished stone with calm confidence. The elderly woman walked toward them, studying Claire for several quiet moments. There was no examination in her gaze. Only gentle understanding. Finally she smiled, reaching out to lightly straighten the edge of Claire's traveling cloak the way a loving grandmother might. "Welcome," she said softly. Claire smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." The woman shook her head ever so slightly. "You do not need to thank those who are simply opening the door meant for you." Claire blinked, touched by words she had never expected to hear. She looked toward Ethan, who simply returned the smallest reassuring smile before the elderly woman continued. "The moon never abandoned you, child. It was leading you away from the place that measured your value incorrectly and toward the place where your heart would finally be seen." Claire felt tears quietly gather in her eyes once more, but she did not hide them. They were no longer tears of loss. They were the peaceful tears of someone who had finally stopped searching for permission to belong. As the evening bells echoed gently across Blackwood Citadel and the last rays of sunlight painted the sky with gold, Claire stepped forward beside Ethan toward the home that awaited her. She entered not as someone rescued because she was weak, but as someone recognized because her quiet kindness had remained stronger than rejection itself, proving that power may command fear for a season, but compassion earns loyalty that lasts a lifetime.